Hi, thank you so much for being here. You could, and probably you should, be listening to John Meacham right now, or Miss Grande, or Mr. Johnson, or Miss Yellen. So thank you very much for being here. I really can't tell you how happy and honored I am to be here. 4 years ago, I was at a reception in Los Angeles, and suddenly this very charming man with a infectious smile came up to me, and he shook his hand, my hand, and he said, the very first words out of his mouth were, "Will you come to the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival?" And I instantly knew I wanted to be Jamie's friend for life. And I confess I'd never been to Rancho Mirage at that point, so I said yes. And 2 years ago, I never forget, I drove out here, and you probably all remember there was a lot of snow on the mountains that year. The air was so clear and pure after the tangle of Los Angeles. The very first moderator that year, many of you remember, was the irresistible and unforgettable Lucy Arnaz, who I thought was the greatest stage presence ever till I heard Mr. Hanks yesterday. I think they're about equal. Jamie and Debbie and Deborah just made all of us feel so at home and so happy. I got to meet many old friends and really many lifelong inspirations. But I think the reason that this festival really won a place in my heart was all of you. And I haven't been at many events where the audience is so deeply engaged, where on a Wednesday morning or afternoon, every room seems almost full, where everybody has led really rich lives. And I think before I came to Rancho Mirage, I always thought bag lunch was a term to dread. And last time I was here, I realized it's something to relish. I so enjoyed meeting everybody. So I actually applied quite a lot of pressure to Jamie to invite me back, which you can be sure has never happened at any other literary festival. And so I'm really delighted to be once more in Rancho Mirage. And I think all of you in this room know that writers are something of an endangered species right now. We feel as if we're running around on the deck of the Titanic to see who's going to go under first. And books can seem like quite an endangered species too in the age of the screen. And so to come to a relatively small town, which has such a huge and beautiful library, and I think where the ratio of books taken out per capita is maybe the largest in the nation or the world, and to come to a town where people are so engaged in words and ideas almost makes me believe that writers have a future, or that we're doing something right. So it's a kind of validation to be here. And I remember the last time I came, I inflicted on various people a lecture about the virtues of going nowhere and sitting still. So I thought the natural thing to talk about today was the virtues of going everywhere and never sitting still, completely to contradict myself. And I often think that our age right now is the first in human history when the fortunate among us, which I think is most of us in this room, can really be in Cape Town or Lhasa, Tibet tomorrow. But it's also the first time in human history when you will hear many people say, what's the point of travel? I can just sit at home and in the palm of my hand, on my smartphone, access places in remotest Tibet you could never see in person. And I think in this age of fake news and virtual reality and artificial intelligence, there's nothing more dangerous than seeing the world through screens and through images. And I think travel has always been a wonderful luxury, but now it's almost a necessity because there's no replacement for seeing the world in the round and in the flesh. And just as with my friend Paul this morning at this same podium, I've been traveling almost without interruption for 44 years. And I sometimes notice that in this age of global connectedness and communication, the distances between us seem to be greater than ever before. And so I thought this afternoon, just for fun's sake and provocation's sake, I might throw out some possible ideas for why that might be, in the hope that you can refute them or refine them or come up with better answers yourselves. But I was remembering, as I was driving here yesterday from Santa Barbara, how 4 years ago, I woke up one morning in Las Vegas. Sounds like it's a joke with a punchline. There's no punchline, alas. But I did get on a plane, and I flew west to San Francisco. And then I flew further west to Osaka. And then I flew to Beijing. And then I got on a final plane. And when I got off at my final destination and looked around, for all the world, I thought I was back in Las Vegas. Because there, right in front of me, was the tallest tourist hotel in the world, 105 stories high, sheathed in blue glass and shaped like a rocket ship. And over there was the Arc de Triomphe, just like the one in Paris, but 30 feet taller. And everywhere I looked, there were thickets of neon-lit skyscrapers and amusement parks and Olympic stadia and a theater designed to look like a watermill. And when I went to check in to my own hotel, which had 2 wings, I found that each wing was 45 stories high. And so I went downstairs into the basement to explore, and the first thing I saw there was 3 slot machines, and then I really thought I was back in Las Vegas. But Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea, to which I was returning, as you all know, couldn't be further from Las Vegas in its basic assumptions and priorities. And when I returned, I was reminded that a typical citizen of North Korea isn't even allowed to set eyes on this showpiece capital or to leave her hometown without permission, with the result that almost no North Korean has ever left her hometown. And even for the fortunate 10% who live in the capital, if one of them so much as glances at a foreign newspaper, he is subject to execution. Even I, just as a visiting tourist, was reminded that if I folded a newspaper containing a photograph of a flower named after the former leader, Kim Jong-il, I was subject to imprisonment. So you're not in Kansas anymore. And of course, the North Korean government is very seasoned and very determined when it comes to making a good impression. That's what all those 260 skyscrapers are about. And I'd been to North Korea before, and I'd seen the ostensible sights, and I knew some of the government's tricks. But nonetheless, I found it makes such a difference to put a face and a voice to a place. And to hear our 26-year-old guide, a very charming and attractive young woman called Miss Peng, tell us how life was really difficult for her, because in North Korea, you have to marry by the age of 25 if you're a woman. And yet she was so committed to her job, she hadn't found a husband and was subject to all kinds of pressures. It was so interesting to go into a subway system and be reminded that the people around you, if you are a visitor, are actors who have been placed there by the government to impersonate regular citizens and strike up a casual conversation with you in English. It was so fascinating to work with a minder who had all kinds of really fascinating stories about working with Dennis Rodman when the former NBA star had visited, and who told us how Mr. Rodman, for whatever reason, refused to call this guide by his name. And that was a surprise, because the guide's name was just one letter, O, Mr. O. But for whatever reason, Dennis Rodman chose to call him Trevor. And none of this really changes the brutality of the regime or the desperation of many people there. But I just find that something like North Korea is such an abstraction in our heads. Even to be able to visualize the streets and the people in the streets makes such a difference. And when I leave North Korea, I always think that the single most terrifying thing about that country is that nobody there has had any contact with the outside world. They know nothing about America, so they're that much more likely to attack us. But when I get back home, what I also get chilled by is that so many of us really know so very little about North Korea. And I think when we hear the word North Korea, just one image usually comes to our head, the image of the leader, not 25 million other people. And of course, that's exactly what such a leader wants. And he also wants the fact that when he says the word America in his country, everybody will see just one face, the face of whoever is in the White House, and not 330 million of the rest of us. And so I sometimes feel that a tiny thing that I can achieve when I go to North Korea is just by my presence reminding any North Korean I meet that a typical American today may not look very much like an occupant of the White House, but may look like me, somebody small and dark and quite interested in their country. And when I think about why we don't know much about North Korea, I think part of the responsibility must lie with the mainstream media. And I can only say that for one reason, and that's that I've been a member of the mainstream media for 36 years now. And I used to write on world affairs for Time magazine, and I remember in those days there were 7 of us, and we covered the whole world, and we drew on the reports of maybe 25 bureaus around the globe. Nowadays, if insofar as Time magazine exists at all, I think there's just one poor soul having to describe the whole world and working with maybe 7 foreign bureaus. And as you all know, our television networks and all our news sources are similarly diminished. So the more global the world becomes, sometimes the more parochial our news becomes. And people will tell you, rightly, well, it doesn't matter because online you can get the most authoritative, wonderful knowledge about every last topic. And that's completely true, but what I find when I go online is that anywhere where you can find everything, it's really hard to find anything. It's very, very difficult to navigate your way to a trustworthy news source. Other people will tell you, well, don't worry, social media is taking the place of mainstream media. But I think what I notice often is that the mainstream media is trying to keep up with social media, so when you pick up your daily newspaper, it's mostly either opinion or snapshots. The net result, though, I think, is that so many of us know dangerously little about North Korea and dangerously much about Brett Kavanaugh's teenage years, or maybe it'll soon be Kamala Harris's kindergarten. But one way or another, we know so much about these tiny things and so little about big things. And I was also remembering, as I was driving over, how only 11 months before I was in North Korea, I was visiting my mother in Santa Barbara, and I got into a plane again, and I flew through a day and a night and another day and part of another night. And when I got off the plane, it was 2:25 in the morning, and I was in the great northern Iranian city of Mashhad. And although it was so late, I had a guide waiting for me when I came out through customs at about 3 in the morning. I quickly found he spoke much better English than I do. He'd been educated at a British boarding school near London in the 1970s, and he led me out into these unexpectedly thronged streets, and we began driving, inching our way through the boulevards of Mashhad. And as we did, he started pointing out every single passerby who looked either like Mr. Bean or John Cleese. Now, this was not really what I'd expected coming to revolutionary Iran. We arrived at a surprisingly luxurious hotel left over from before the revolution. And of course, I eagerly went up to look at my room. And it was a very small space, but it had everything I needed. And it essentially boasted 3 amenities. It had an arrow pointing to Mecca. It had a copy of the Holy Quran. And it had a television set. And I thought, fantastic, my first chance ever to see Iranian TV. So I excitedly turned it on. And what should I see but Piers Morgan on CNN talking about gun control. And this was so unexpected. I thought, well, I've got to tell this to all my friends back in Santa Barbara. So I went online to send some emails. And lo and behold, the internet connection in Mashhad was much faster than the ones in the hills of Santa Barbara. Maybe 2 hours later, it was time for breakfast. So I went down to the lobby, and I saw that there was a mosque in the lobby, but right next to the mosque was a high-end Swarovski jewelry shop. And all around were the most chic and elegant young women I've ever seen in the latest from Chanel or Dior under their hijabs, tapping away at smartphones. And I went out into the street to see where exactly we'd landed up, because it had been hard to make out at 3 in the morning. And I found we were on this broad, very modern, spotless street lined with high-rises. So I went across the street to see what they were. Almost everyone was a bank. It really looked as if I was in Dubai. And I can sincerely say that every hour of the next 16 days was equally full of surprises. But that very first night, I thought, well, I want to see this country uncensored, unmediated, by myself. So I told my driver and my guide to go off and have dinner, and I snuck down to the taxi desk in the lobby. And the people there very kindly introduced me to a young driver who was really, really friendly and spoke good English, very good English. So he led me out to his little car, and we took off into the dark. Unbeknownst to me, I had arrived in Mashhad on the single most festive week of the year there, because it's the birthday of the saint who is buried in its central shrine. And so all the main streets were strung with fairy lights, and 7 million pilgrims had come from every corner of the Shia world to be there. And so when we arrived at the main shrine, which is really just 7 huge marble courtyards, we could barely move. Everywhere there were people seated on the ground, on carpets, sipping tea, releasing doves into the blue-black night, stretched out to sleep sometimes because they were spending 7 days and 7 nights there. And they were surrounded by huge video screens on which black-clad ayatollahs were delivering sermons. It was really quite a scene. And my taxi driver had decided by then that I was a fairly harmless sort, kind of sympathetic guy. I'd come all this way to learn about his culture. So he invited me in with him to the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum where the saint is buried. And it was a tiny space, maybe a quarter the size of this room, jam-packed, of course. And after we were shuffling around for a few minutes, I looked across, and I saw that my driver's hand was on his heart. And he was walking backwards, so he would never present his back to the long-dead saint. And there were tears welling in his eyes. He looked like just the picture of Islamic piety and devotion. But when we were back out on the street, walking to his car, he started telling me about his wife, who was, he said, a blonde Yorkshire woman who was waiting for him in England and expecting their first child. And then he told me how he had paid a human trafficker $2,500 to smuggle him into England in the back of a truck, breathing through a tube so he wouldn't be detected. And then he told me how the British government had very magnanimously given him a court-appointed lawyer and translator who had worked for 3 whole years to win him asylum status in Britain. In other words, he had risked his life to flee Iran, and now every summer he was risking his life to come back into his hometown to see the mother and the mosque and the friends that he missed so much. And when he dropped me back that evening at my hotel, I thought to myself, well, Iran has really been in our headlines every day for the past year. But I couldn't remember ever reading about a really devout and faithful Islamic soul who didn't want to live in an Islamic republic. And I couldn't remember ever hearing about a dissident stealing back into the country that he'd risked his life to flee. And this was embarrassing to me because I'm sort of a journalist. I travel a lot. I try to keep up with the news. It was doubly embarrassing, though, because I am the guy who used to write articles on Iran for Time magazine, drawing on the reports of my colleagues in the field. And it was quadruply embarrassing because I once spent 4 whole years of my life reading up on and researching everything I could get about Iran to publish a 370-page novel, partly set there, though I had never been. And yet, as you can tell, within really 4 hours of arriving, I had learned more than 4 years of research on the other side of the world. And I'd say within 16 hours of arriving, I saw that I didn't have a clue about this country. And in some ways, I think it confirmed a suspicion I had, which is that in the age of information, I was just telling my new friend down here, we sometimes know less about the world than ever before. And I think we sometimes know least of all about the countries we hear most of all about, such as Iran and North Korea and Syria and Cuba and Yemen, because we hear a lot about their leaders and maybe their nuclear policies, but not so much about daily life and just regular folks there. And I think many of us in different way are also keenly aware that sometimes in this global world, it's easier than ever to be provincial, to surround ourselves with people who sound like us and think like us and feel like us. But the net result was I came away thinking, well, everything that's really interesting about Iran and everything that's complex and maybe contradictory is exactly what falls between the cracks and never reached me when I was living in Santa Barbara. And I also realized that all the images in the world don't add up to real life. Now, I think everybody in this room knows that culturally, we all share more than we've ever done before. Actually, now I think of it, while I was in Iran, in Isfahan, I saw all the cool kids racing into a place called Kansas Fried Chicken, which I guess was the closest they could get to Kentucky. And of course, in North Korea, the former leader famously sent his Japanese chef all the way to Beijing to fetch him a Big Mac. But none of that makes either of those countries less hostile to us or really more on our wavelength. And although we share more than ever before, that doesn't diminish the amount that we don't share. And I sometimes feel that everywhere you go in the world, almost, except for North Korea, the people you meet are familiar with Starbucks and Brad Pitt and CNN. But in every culture, they translate Starbucks and Brad Pitt and CNN into their own language and really into their own context and their own history as well. And I think the result is it's as if all the world is watching the same film, but we all come out of it having seen a totally different movie. And one example that often comes to my mind, though it's not such a recent one, but I'm sure some of you might have seen the movie The Sixth Sense from a few years ago. It's about a single mother who has a little boy who sees ghosts. And in response, she takes him to a psychiatrist, unexpectedly played by Bruce Willis. And I happened to see that movie as soon as it came out in Japan. And as I was watching it, and as I looked at my Japanese wife and my Japanese neighbors, I noticed they weren't freaked out at all by the ghosts in that movie. They have been living quite comfortably with ghosts in Japan for 1,400 years. But they did seem really freaked out by the psychiatrist. Because it sounds silly, but traditionally they really don't have those in their culture. When I moved to Japan in the late 1980s, there were 4 registered psychoanalysts in the whole of Greater Tokyo, population 15 million. And as I witnessed this, I thought, well, if we were watching the same movie right now in Iraq, they wouldn't be freaked out by the ghosts, they probably wouldn't be freaked out by the psychiatrist, but they might very well be really unsettled by the notion of a single mother leading her little boy alone through the world. And then by chance, I came back to Santa Barbara to visit my own mother. And she said to me, hey, have you seen this new movie, The Sixth Sense? I really want to see it. So I gallantly accompanied my mother to the Cineplex. And in Santa Barbara, people were just freaked out that Bruce Willis was trying to act. I apologize to any Bruce Willis fans in the audience. And don't worry, I'm sure it's never going to happen again. But it's a silly example. But nonetheless, I think whatever the cultural artifact of the moment is, it goes through a similar transformation. When Avatar came out, I think if you saw it in Lebanon, it was a film about colonialism. And if you saw it in Beijing, it'd be a film about environmentalism. And if you saw it down I-10 in LA, it was a demonstration of this very cool new technology. And you probably remember how exactly 100 years ago, it used to be said that England and America were 2 cultures divided by a common language. And I think now it's almost as if we're 200 cultures divided by a common pop cultural frame of reference or global lexicon. And I think my experience as a lifelong traveler is it's not such a small world, and the differences and distances between us, as I said, if anything, growing greater because of the illusion of familiarity or closeness. We assume because we share Starbucks, we share many other things, and often that isn't the case. And for me, that's part of what makes the world so fascinating and impossible to anticipate and endlessly surprising. I remember I took my mother once on a trip around Galilee, and we had a tour guide who I thought of as typically Israeli, in the sense that he was very quick-witted, he was very funny, and he was always taking the mickey out of himself. And at the end of this quite long and complicated day, he looked across at us and he said, "Wait, you're looking confused. Are you confused?" And we said, "Yeah, we actually were feeling quite confused." And he said, "Well, wait a minute. Do you feel as if you know less now than you did when the day began?" And we said, "Yeah, we do." And he rubbed his hands together with glee and said, "Excellent. I have made you understand what it is to be an Israeli." Because we don't have a clue. We don't know what's going to happen in the next hour. We have trouble telling friend from foe. We're living in this constant state of bewilderment and on the edge. And we can't live in the dangerous assumption we know everything about the world. And it's certainly true. I've lived in Japan now 31 and a half years, and I often feel I know less than when I arrived there. When I get into a train near my apartment and go to the local baseball stadium, in Japan, I'm reminded that baseball games end in a tie if the score is level after 12 innings. And that means that a team with lots of ties can actually finish ahead of a team with more victories when it comes to winning percentage. And that means that a Japanese baseball team isn't playing to win, it's playing in order not to lose. And that means that when the very first American manager came over to Japan in 1995, Bobby Valentine, he was given charge of a really, really bad team. And he led this extremely mediocre team to a stunning second-place finish, and he was instantly fired. And the foreign reporters didn't really know what to make of this, so they went to this team spokesman and said, "What's with this? Why did you fire Bobby Valentine after this really successful season?" Back came the answer, "Because of his emphasis on winning." Now, I think where Bobby Valentine comes from, and where I come from, where most of you come from in this country, winning is a good thing. In Japan, maybe not. And those kind of really fundamental differences, again, I think, add to the richness and complexity of the world and make it even harder for us to understand Japan while we're sitting in California. And I think it also means that I'm sure you found, because this is a very well-traveled audience, that when you go to a foreign place, it's often the things you expect to be most familiar that turn out to be strangest, whether it's McDonald's or the Starbucks or the CNN broadcast. So maybe I'll just tell one final story so we have quite a bit of time for questions that for me dramatizes exactly why I take to the road. Earlier this century, I went to Yemen. Gosh, I get husky just thinking of it. Now, why was I going to Yemen? Why else? I was retracing the footsteps of a 15th century Chinese eunuch Muslim admiral who led his ships all the way across the South China Sea and Indian Ocean as far as East Africa and the perfume coast of Oman and Yemen. And as most of you know, China hasn't traditionally been committed to exploration in the same way that Europe has been, but there was just this one moment in the 15th century when they sent these 7 long ships, or these long ships really on 7 profound explorations right the way across the ocean. And in the course of my trip, I found myself in the southern Yemeni city, port city of Aden. And as it happens, I had been in Aden at the age of 2 in 1959. And in 1959, Aden was the largest port in the entire world outside of Manhattan. So you all know port cities. It buzzed with that half-illicit activity when people come to greet the arriving ships with postcards and promises of the red light zone and all kinds of other, sometimes dubious local attractions. When I returned to Aden earlier this century, it was really to find the most devastated, shattered place I'd ever seen. It had been through 40 years of warfare. The British had left, the Russians had come in, North Yemen was fighting against South Yemen, and the result was there were no shops, no restaurants, barely any streets. When you would see goats foraging on the main street, and when an occasional car stopped at a red light, sunken-cheeked old women would emerge from the shadows and hammer on the windows for a handout. It was very, very difficult to find a place to stay there, of course, but I finally found quite a nice Sheraton on the beach. Every time I entered that hotel, though, I had to walk through a security machine, as at our airports. And when I finally went out to the beach, it was this pristine, golden sanded place fronting a beautiful bay, absolutely empty. And then I looked more closely, and I noticed there were 3 armed soldiers on that side and 3 armed soldiers on that side, and protecting me, I guess, from Yemen. And my experience has been that often in the countries where people have least to give, they're most generous and most kind and probably most happy to meet occasional foreigners. So I walked out of my hotel one day, and a man came up to me, and he spoke very good English. He said, "Sir, would you like to look around?" I said, "Yeah, please. What's there to see?" And he said, "The cemetery." And we spent this long, hot afternoon walking around, seeing the graves of his mother and his sister and his father, various nuns. Really, everybody who had tried to be of help to Yemen seemed to have ended up there. And when I went back into my hotel, a man from the front desk came up to me, and he had promised to reconfirm my flight out. And he said, "Sir, there's a small problem. There's a delay." And I said, "Oh, that's no problem at all. How long?" And he said, 2 days. And I looked at him, and I looked at this town that really didn't seem connected with the world I recognized. And I thought, 2 days could be 2 years. It could be 2 decades. I could never possibly leave this town. And I needed to be out the next day because my wife was flying all the way from Japan to Greece to meet me, and my editors were impatiently awaiting their report on following the footsteps of the 15th century Chinese Muslim eunuch admiral. So I went out, and the dusk was falling, and I found this really battered jalopy, and it jolted us over this pothole street to the downtown area of Aden, which appropriately is called Crater. And I went into the Yemenia Airlines office. And there was a very large woman dressed in a black veil in the office, and I presented to her my predicament. She turned around and she began tapping very, very slowly on a computer. And after a long, long time, she said the only way I could get out was by driving then and there right the way across the country to the capital, Sana'a, in the north, and taking a flight out the next morning at 6 a.m. This was not such good news because, as I say, North Yemen and South Yemen had been at war for most of the preceding years. And it was also even less good news because the traditional source of revenue for all the villages en route was the kidnapping of foreigners. They've been doing that since the 13th century. They don't harm us, but what they do is when they see a foreigner, they kidnap us, contact the appropriate embassy, get some money, and then release us. But I thought, well, even so, I have to sign on to this. So I said I would take that ticket, and she slowly made out a new ticket, and then very painstakingly gave me $40 because my new ticket cost less than the one I was canceling. And then I went out, and it was just a pitch black night. Fortunately, I found a man who spoke English, and with his help, I found a small old man who was so desperate and impoverished, he agreed then and there to drive me right the way across the country. And so we got into this battered white Peugeot station wagon. He got behind the wheel. I got the distinct sense he'd never been behind the wheel of a car before. And we took off into the dark, absolute dark. And very soon we were up in the mountains, and there was nothing but the medieval tower houses of Yemen with their lights eerily coming through the little slits in them. And we went around a corner, and suddenly there was a roadblock, and there was a bunch of teenage kids with AK-47s, and they clustered around the car, and I guess the driver paid them off. So we kept on going, and then we went around another turn, more young boys with guns. Again, they surrounded us. He paid them off again, again through the night. And finally, just as the first call to prayer was rising up at 4 in the morning, we arrived at the capital and we located the airport terminal, and I raced in and I managed to get the flight to Dubai. But as I was sitting on the plane, of course, I thought how now that poor old man had to drive all the way back across the country just to return home. And as it happens, 5 weeks later, I was back in my mother's house in Santa Barbara, and really I was one morning just sitting at my desk writing and thinking, how can I possibly put what I saw in Aden in the same sentence as this very comfortable, protected, almost gated Californian resort town? And as I was working on this, suddenly my mother came into the room, and she said, "That crazy place you just visited, Yemen, it's on all our screens right now because there were these planes flying into the World Trade Center. And we're being told that they're masterminded by somebody called Osama bin Laden, whose home village is in Yemen. And most of the hijackers are probably from Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is our ally, so really Yemen is a place that we need to take very, very seriously and think of as a threat to us. And it's certainly true, as you all know, to this day, Yemen is a base for terrorists and for troublemakers. And in fact, more so now than it was in 2001. The last time I looked, though, the State Department said that there were 4,000 members of al-Qaeda in Yemen. There were 28 million Yemenites, and I think most of the people I met in Yemen were really eager to come to this country. They had loved ones here. This was the place they wanted to be. And when Yemen was suddenly in the news, I was so grateful, just as really a bungling tourist, that I could remember that sad-eyed man who led me around the graveyard. And the woman in the airline office who was so honest as to give me the $40 she could easily have pocketed herself and would have transformed her life through. And to remember that old man who probably risked his life to drive me all the way across the country in the dead of night. And just maybe 2 weeks ago, I was reading a book by the former British Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, about the global refugee crisis. And in it, he mentions meeting a photojournalist in a refugee camp. And the photojournalist said, "You know, when you look at the statistics, you just feel despair. But when you look at the faces, you feel hope." And I'm so glad that all of you, I know, have traveled a lot. And by traveling, you put a human face where previously there was only an abstraction or a statistic. And you put hope where previously there was just despair. So thank you so much for listening so patiently. And we have 8 minutes for questions, and a question very quickly.
Where have you not been that you'd like to go?
So many places. The question is, where have I not been that I would like to go? And I have a huge list because I really feel the world is inexhaustible. My parents come from India. And even within India, I've never been to Kerala, I've never been to many of the places that a typical visitor has seen. Within this country, actually, I've never been to North Dakota or seen Mount Rushmore or been much in the deep south. So I never run out of places that I'm keen to see. But I think at some point I reached the age where I noticed if I had free time, I much preferred seeing my old friends rather than trying to make new friends. And sometimes watching movies I'd enjoyed already and rereading books that had meant a lot to me. And so in that same spirit, I often nowadays prefer to go back to places that I've known throughout my life. And it's like picking up a conversation. You don't have to introduce yourself. You don't have to start learning the basics. But you notice how you've changed and how they've changed. And everything is in constant evolution. So even going back to the same place again and again. When I arrived in Rancho Mirage yesterday, my first stop was at the theater, and that's completely different than it was 2 years ago. And I'm sure there are many other changes all of you know about. So I think that's the blessing of the world. You don't have to travel far, or you don't even have to travel to a new place to be exhilarated. I was just with my wife on a cruise ship from San Francisco to Papeete. And because of storms in San Francisco, we were stuck there for 24 hours. And we started walking around the deck of the ship, and I realized in 50 years of being based in California, I'd never seen San Francisco in the round. I'd never seen it from the actual bay. And suddenly, I was seeing a town I thought I knew in a radically different way. So, Marcel Proust wonderfully said, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeing new sights, but in looking with new eyes. And once you have new eyes, even your spouse, even your hometown, even your backyard looks something exciting and fresh. So I think often bringing new eyes to the old places is exciting for me too. Yes, please, first and then second.
He suggested that we should be listening to John Meacham, but I want to tell you I've never listened to a more charming speaker. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. So no question, just a compliment. Good. Any compliments welcome. No, but thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
She's a hard act to follow. I see that you're a biographer of the Dalai Lama.
Yes.
Is there anything fairly concise that you can tell us
Yes, so the question was, I've spent, since I was 17, I've been talking and traveling with the Dalai Lama, and I once wrote a book about him, and if there's something concise I could say about him, the first thing you will know already, which is if he's right here, and you were meeting him for the first time, you would feel you were meeting your oldest friend in the world. Instantly, and I think Pope Francis has the same gift, instantly he cuts through all the formality, and there he is, as if he's your brother or your uncle or whatever. In terms of his influence in the world, I think the beauty of the global moment is, of course, in the course of his life, things have got harder and harder and harder in Tibet. But the beauty is that Tibet is now a part of Los Angeles and Santa Fe and Switzerland and Sydney and Paris and so many parts of the world. And I often think how when I was born, fewer than 2,000 Westerners in the whole of history had ever set foot in Tibet. Nobody I met thought they would ever even go to a Tibetan restaurant, let alone hear a Tibetan teacher, let alone hear the Dalai Lama. And it's so exciting, and we sometimes take it for granted, that now any of us in this room can hear all the great leaders of the world, whether it's Archbishop Tutu or Pope Francis or His Holiness the Dalai Lama. They're coming to California. We can go to Tibet. And I think one reason I traveled was I didn't want to take for granted this great opportunity that no previous generation had had. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, having watched the Dalai Lama closely for 44 years, is how, as you probably know, he's the most visible Buddhist in the world, but when he comes to California, he tells us, don't become Buddhists. Stay within your Judeo-Christian tradition or stay within your atheist tradition. That's fine. The most important thing is just kindness and responsibility towards the people around you. And I think it's very liberating to hear a religious figure say, don't follow my religion, but do remember what the essential things are. And I think the other beautiful aspect of the Dalai Lama's life, again because of our global world, is that he calls himself a defender of Islam. He's lived most of his life in a predominantly Hindu country. He has lectured on the Gospels to groups of Christians. And I think his greatest delight in life is talking to scientists, many of whom are atheists. And again, he says, well, when I was stuck in Lhasa, I couldn't learn about any of the other great traditions in the world. Now I have everybody to learn from. And all of us have the chance to learn from him, whatever our background. So I think he may sometimes feel a little sad that in the last 83 and a half years while he's been alive, Tibet's situation has got worse. But he also knows history is cyclical, and at some point things will get much better. And I hope he takes delight in the fact that for generations into the future, people are going to be inspired by him as they were by Dr. King and Gandhi and so many others. So I think he's made a greater impact maybe than his modest self would acknowledge. But there's too much I have to say about him, but thank you for opening that door. Yes, please. It's, how did I get into North Korea? It's not actually that difficult. There are travel agencies in Beijing run by foreigners who've been organizing these tours for a long time, and they know how to do it in a very easy way. I have a British passport, but they told me it was better to go on an American passport, which was interesting. And on my most recent trip, I went on I had to go in a group. There were a group of 14 of us. And of course, one of the wonderful things if you go to North Korea is that your fellow travelers are so interesting. So there were 2 people from Apple Computers in Cupertino who were taking an 18-month-long sabbatical. There was an Iranian physician who was an expert on kidneys. There was a very kindly retired lawyer from Miami with his wife. They'd seen many places, but they thought this would be a different place. And I did go in as a journalist. When I went most recently, I was covering the film industry in North Korea. And they have a big film festival there, as if this were Palm Springs. And the former leader was said to have the largest private film library in the world, 20,000 videos. And as with Lenin, they've realized that films are a great propaganda tool. So I actually got to watch North Korean films screened by their directors in this massive studio. It looks like a ghost town, but it's technically larger than any studio in Hollywood. And I was going as a journalist. And the interesting thing was when I contacted the man in Beijing, I said, well, maybe it's not such a good thing for me to go as an American journalist into an enemy country. And he said, don't worry, North Koreans are savvy. They know that a lot of people who come here are going to take pictures or write articles, and they know what we're going to say, and they know there's nothing they can do about them. The only thing they don't want to see, he said, is a missionary or somebody who's proselytizing. And as you know, there have been Americans who've gone there and foreigners, and they've got in trouble because they're accused of handing out Bibles. And from the North Korean point of view, the real threat comes if you're presenting a religion that is an alternative to their religion. Their religion is their leaders were their gods. And so a Christian or other missionary is really, they see as a head-on assault. A journalist, they're savvy enough just to say, well, we know what he's up to. So there are 11 seconds left, just time enough for me to say thank you, and please enjoy the rest of this amazing festival.